First of all, just like to personally thank the Couldnt family for hosting this event and acknowledge Rabbi Rothschild's efforts to put this project together. The suggestion was that we speak a little bit about the problem of ordeals, crisis, the Jewish approach, the Torah approach, or understanding of these things. And perhaps the best way to approach it is to understand the depths of the subject of laughter. Let's see if we can try and build together a deep understanding of the correct understanding of this issue and how it connects and leads us into a deeper understanding of ordeal, crisis. First tool in being able to cope with these things is an understanding of what they mean. We may discover together that the Jewish subject of laughter is not that funny. There's a depth to it which is very serious. Let's try and build this idea level by level and see where it takes us. First of all, I presume you have no problem listening to English without an accent. Right? How do we approach an issue like laughter? Let's look at some of the deepest currents of thinking that are available to us in Torah thought and see if we can find or discover tools together to get to this subject. Now, we'll need a few minutes of introduction in order to build the tool that we'll need. We have an axiom which states as follows. Every experience that we go through, we want to study laughter this evening. Every experience that we go through, that we have, is a projection of something deeper. That's the first thing to understand. We have a conception that the physical world is a projection of the light of a deeper world. And just like light projected on a screen tells you about the source of that light, even though you may not be able to see it, we can learn about the spiritual world, and we can only learn about the spiritual world through an analysis of the physical. The Gaon of Vilna put it in this way. He said that when you study the physical world, what you're looking at is the imprint that remains when a stamp, he called it michoitam lenechtam, I guess in English you call it a seal or a signet or an imprint, something that has an embossed face. When you print that, when you press that into a soft material, it leaves its imprint. You could then use that when it hardens to print that into something soft, and you could do that many times. The Gaon says that this world is the result of many worlds, each of which imprints its pattern on a lower one, which in turn imprints its pattern on a lower one, and so forth until the final result is this world. When you have a series of these stamps and you look at the last one, you are, no matter how long you look at that and how intensely you study it, you'll never see the original. But you're seeing an exact copy. That's the concept we have of this world. No matter how long you look at any object or phenomenon in this world, you are not seeing the source, but you're seeing an exact copy of some very high dimension that's the origin of this thing which is projected here. And therefore, if you study it well, you'll be able to recognize, you'll be able to understand the depth of that point of origin. Perhaps a more modern analogy would be a movie. Right? Imagine you went to see a movie. Of course, no one in present company, I'm sure, would do such a thing. But imagine if you went to see, imagine there were a movie kosher enough to see. So you're watching this light on a screen. In fact, it's an illusion. Right? But you can get very lost in the illusion. In fact, some people do. That illusion is a projection of something else. If you're a seeker for the truth, while everyone else is watching the movie, you will go into the projection room and find where that light is being projected to find the real source of this thing, and even there you'll be disappointed, because you'll find a strip of celluloid with some pictures on. In fact, that itself is an illusion, which is a reflection of time and place that is far distant. You are many stages away from the point of origin when you're watching that movie, but if you watch it carefully, when you one day see those places and meet those people, you'll recognize them, because you're watching an exact copy. You have to understand how to transmit, how to transmute the dimension that you're watching, which is two-dimensional, into the point of origin, which is three-dimensional. You have to know how to do that. But we have a natural talent for being able to do that. And that's The Shlo says that the reason we study the depths of Torah, it's a beautiful analogy, the reason we study the depth of Torah in this world is only so that we'll understand the point of origin when we see it. Here we cannot understand it. He gives a beautiful analogy. He says, if you imagine a group of people shipwrecked on a desert island, and on that island a child is born, and the child is one day taken aside. One of the parents, one of the adults takes a child aside and says, I'm going to teach you Aleph Beis. The child says, what's that? The parent says, scratches out in the sand an Aleph and a Beis. Child says, what does this mean? The parent says, you can't understand what this means. But when we get back where we came from, you will discover things called books. And in those books, the wisdom of the world is written. And if you study this with me now, you'll be able to read them when you get there. The child has to take it on faith. The child doesn't see a book. The child learns an Aleph, an isolated Aleph, a Beis, learns the rules. But one day when they get back where they came from and the child is exposed to libraries of books, all that wisdom is accessible. And the Shlo says that's how we study the depth of Torah in this world. To us, all it can ever mean is an Aleph and a disjointed Beis. No matter how deep we get, it can only be those building blocks. But the reason we do it is so that when we finally transition into the source where the real wisdom is written, so then we'll recognize it because of the work we put in here. And therefore, the concept that we need is to understand that what we experience here is a projection of something that's real. It's real, but transcending the dimension that we can apprehend. We don't have a sense organ to be able to apprehend that world, so we study its projection. But it's good enough. Of course, the classic example and the prime example is relating to a human being. When you relate to a person, there are two aspects to the person. There's the body that carries them to the relationship, the vehicle that they inhabit, and then there's the person inside. That difference that exists 1 second before a person dies and 1 second after, whatever that thing is which we cannot see, call it the personality, the soul, the neshama, that inner essence is what we're really looking for. But the paradox and the absurdity of the world is that you can never get in touch with that internality except through the body. No matter how well you know someone, you can know somebody intimately and live with them for 50 years. But you never see beyond the tip of their nose. You never see the person. All you ever see is the body. But it's good enough because the nuances of movement of the body are all you need to read in to what's happening inside. The Kuzari says that it could be absurd that the crudeness of the body as a tool for giving you insight into the subtlety of the neshama is an absurdity. But that's the way it is. Sometimes it could be in a relationship, at a critical moment in a relationship. It could be that a subtle change of expression on a person's face shows you that they understood what you meant. And the relationship could change forever because of that moment. And in fact, what transpired between you was nothing other than you're reading, some muscles twitching. Right? A very crude and finite change in the physical world. But that's good enough to give you access to what's happening inside. In fact, we are so talented at it that we don't even realize there's a body in between. When we relate to a person and we hear the words that they speak, or the movements of their body, or the expressions of their face, we don't even realize that there's a body in between. We have such a natural skill of being able to translate it into what's happening inside, that what happens is the relationship. We have to learn that everything in the world is only a bodily image, which is moving, and its nuances of movement are showing us a depth that we need to sensitize ourselves to be able to translate. Now, if that's the axiom, then it follows that everything in the physical world can teach us about something in the spiritual world. The depth of this is that every single thing in the Torah, everything that Hashem wants us to experience or understand, He projects into physicality, and everything in the physical world has been projected from a spiritual source. If you like, an analogy would be that the spiritual world, the Torah if you like, which is Hashem's direct expression, is the genes of the physical world. If you study the genes, if you take a person who has blue eyes, and you study the genes of that person, you will find that the genes there code for blue eyes. And you'd be a fool to be surprised. And if you took those genes and you said, wow, they code, of course, genes for blue eyes don't look blue. You have to know how to look at genes. But if you know how to look at the genetic material, you'll see that whatever's written there, which means blue, when it's translated later or projected later into the reality of the physical body, blue eyes are the result. The Torah, if you like, is the genetic material of the world. It comes first. People who say that the Torah is wonderful and deep because it knows the world so well that it reflects it accurately, that's an anti-Semitic, nonsensical statement. People who say that the Torah and the sages of the Torah are so deep and perceptive that they plumb the depths of the world and describe it accurately. It's a completely reversed idea. It's not a Jewish idea. The correct concept is that the Torah says the thing, that's why the world looks that way. Right? The Torah comes first and projects its reality into the world. That's the concept. And therefore, with this introduction, we can take any concept, a tool that we need to learn to use in general, but we can take any idea, any concept, any phenomenon, any experience, any emotion, and understand it as a projection of something deeper. Let's apply this tool to the concept of laughter. Now, with these eyes, we'll have to look a little differently at laughter. So if one was unfortunate enough to grow up in the lap of Western culture, where the teaching is that everything's an accidental, random event. So somebody brought up like that, thinks that laughter is the vestige. It's a vestigial remnant of something that happened when you were in the trees or someplace else prior to this level of existence, something that was necessary for survival, and so it's more or less with us now. But a Jew doesn't look at the world that way. The concept we have is that if it's part of our consciousness and part of our functioning, it must be a projection of something that's meaningful. And therefore, when we laugh, we need to know what that's reflecting. That's a remarkable experience, laughter. That's a uniquely human experience, and it's a remarkable thing. What does it mean in terms of depth? Well, let's study it together. How do we access such an idea? Well, we said that the principle we use is we analyze, we dissect the object or the phenomenon or the experience in the world objectively and openly, and we then can project it into what it must mean in the source. So let's do that together. Let's look at laughter and see what it can teach us about its source, and see how that can lead us to a deeper understanding of ordeal and crisis. Now remember, all we have to do is study the phenomenon. If we can pin it down accurately, we'll then have the tool to be able to delve into its inner depth. What makes people laugh? If you think about it, you'll realize that it is the sudden transition or the juxtaposition, the sharply opposed juxtaposition of two opposite things, especially when the counterpoint, when the juxtaposition of the two things is sharp, extreme, and unexpected. So that contrast is what generates laughter. When a process is going in one direction and then unexpectedly it flips or snaps into its opposite, right? That is what causes laughter, even when the event's not funny. That means when there's no, you know that laughter has as one of its components joy. Simcha is one of the experiences of, one of the elements that comprise the concept or the experience of laughter. And you'll notice that what makes us laugh and feel a welling of joy is sometimes something that's not funny at all. That needs understanding. Here's a tall, very conceited, pompous individual walking down the street, and suddenly and unexpectedly slips on a banana peel, right? And is laid out flat on the street, right? From the extreme of conceit and pride into the abyss of degradation. That's someone who deserves it, of course. So what happens is that if you, even as you run to help such an individual, you cannot hide a smile. But if you analyze what's happening, there's nothing funny about that. It's a tremendously painful and degrading experience. So why are you smiling? If you smile at such a thing, there's something wrong with you. And yet you cannot help it. Right? What's the reason for that? Why do we do that? What's the meaning of that? And why is there joy associated with such a thing? It's a tremendous problem. Right? Even if you have sympathy for such a thing. And it can be as silly as a person, again, who's conceited and overconfident, right, who's walking into a situation of power and control where he thinks everyone is, and a child has pinned a bushy tail to the back of his suit. It's ridiculous. It's tremendously painful. The person will never live that down. And yet there's a humor in the situation. That is very problematic. What does that mean? Let's try and put our finger on the depth of this. The concept is this. Laughter is, let's state the principle and then let's try and feel it out together. Laughter is the human response of a sharp transition from one situation to another. In the depth of the soul, it's the human response, spiritual laughter, is the response of the transition from ordeal to redemption. In that pathway, that movement from ordeal, and particularly from the kind of ordeal that becomes crisis, into redemption, that transition is what generates genuine laughter in the spiritual world, not the empty laughter of foolishness that we have in this world, the slapstick and silly examples that make us laugh at a cheap and infantile level. But those infantile experiences, that immaturity, is a reflection of something that lives in the deepest levels of creation. In fact, remarkable idea is that the greatest transition, the sharpest juxtaposition of opposites, of the most extreme opposites, is the transition from this world to the next. And that spiritually is what's really funny. That's the source of genuine, when the Torah talks about laughter, right? It says, Az yimale schok pinu, for example. Right? We say, then our mouth shall be filled with laughter. Halachically, it's a halacha that a Jew should not laugh with complete abandon in this world. To laugh with complete abandon, as a mouth totally, completely filled with laughter, is inappropriate. To laugh that way in a world that's full of suffering, even if there's just someone suffering, just one person suffering, let alone the kind of things that we experience around us. To laugh completely, fully, that's insensitive. And therefore, Jews should not do that. But as yimale schok pinu, then our mouth will be filled with laughter. And the simple interpretation means that when this is over, and the torment and tragedy is over, so then the laughter will happen. But there's a much deeper meaning, and you heard it referred to this evening. It's not that because this is over, the laughter will be. It's because this was. It's because this dimension generated that dimension. That will be genuine love when you suddenly see that a process leading in one direction, in fact, was building the opposite. A process leading in one direction, that is a process of sadness. That's a process of agony and crisis. When you suddenly realize that it was that agony that built the eternity, that is genuinely, that's a mouth completely filled with laughter. We have many expressions of that in Torah. It says, Vatischak leyoim acharon. Remarkable thing again. A woman of greatness. A woman of greatness will laugh at the last day. It means the day of death. Laugh at the day of death? That's a Jewish, what does that mean? We weep at such a day. But it means somebody who's prepared in depth and understands what that transition means. Who knows that what looks like mourning and weeping from here is a redemption and a birth from the other side. So that's and of course it's a woman. It's a woman who laughs because she's the agent of birth. She's the being that goes through the birth, but she can bring that into the world. So she most potently feels that. When do we sing that, by the way? What's our tradition is Friday night, right? When Shabbos comes in, we sing Eishes Chayil, and it's then that we say Vatischak leyom acharon. Why Friday night? Isn't that the transition from the week, with its finite limitation, into the transcendence of Shabbos? That's a minute experience. That's a miniature experience of the transition, right, from this world to the next. Shabbos is ma'en olam haba. It's a flavor. It's a slight taste of the final dimension of eternity. And therefore, when the week transitions into Shabbos, and we feel just a taste of that elevation, so then we say, Vatischak leyom acharon. That is the simcha. That is the depth of laughter. You know, in the deeper sources, the way this is usually referred to is that usually the description is of the mother. When the mother's going through the birth process, it doesn't look funny at all. It doesn't look happy at all. It doesn't look like a life-giving experience at all. If you stumbled into a room where a woman was giving birth, you wouldn't be amused. She's not amused, and you wouldn't be amused. If you weren't prepared for it, you would be struck. You would be horrified. And in fact, what's happening there is that the difficulty and the apparent negativity and what looks in every way like a death experience is bringing life to the world. And it's the pain of the experience that is bringing the life to the world. Right? The paradox of that experience is, despite its difficulty and pain, when that experience is complete, the mother wouldn't give up any of that pain. When the pain is over, she relishes every moment of pain. Why? Because it's that pain that brought this life into the world. That's the process. In fact, there's an even more remarkable aspect of that process. You hear in this discussion, of course, not only the process of human birth, you hear in this discussion the final redemption. It's why we refer to the Messianic Advent as being birth pangs, birth pains, because the world then will go through tremendous ordeal and crisis, and it will be the crisis and ordeal itself that gives rise to the final redemption, revelation, transition. Right? Not that the crisis has to be over before we can get there. The crisis has to be so that we can get there. It doesn't look that way from here. And some of the predictions of the Messianic transition are of awesome and frightening. But we understand that it will be necessary in order to generate what has to be generated. The Rambam was once faced with a question regarding this transition, which is worth repeating, remarkable illustration of this. He relates in this issue to the process that the child goes through. We are used to speaking about the mother. If you read sources that talk about these things in depth, they talk about a woman in the travail of labor and what she goes through and how the experience of pain and suffering is a transition into life-giving. But it's remarkable to consider the child who's going through that process as well. Let me share with you what the Rambam says about this. The Rambam was once faced by a group of philosophers who followed the Greek tradition, and they asked him the following question. They said this: you Jews are wicked because you teach that death leads to life, and we see that life leads to death. So why do you foist upon the world this redemption concept, this messianic concept, this concept that crisis leads to redemption, that death leads to life? We don't see that. When we study the world, we see that everything that lives disintegrates, winds down, and finally dies. So how do you come and tell us that the process of disintegration and death in fact leads to life? But you have to understand the depth of this question is that they were asking a question based on the axioms that we use. Right? They were saying, you teach us that we have to look at the world and learn from it. That's what we said this evening. You teach us, you Jews teach us, that we look at the physical expression and we interpret that and we project it back to its source. So let's do that. Let's look at the world. When we look at the world, we see that life leads to death. We're using the tools that you've taught us. So how can you come along and say death leads to life? That's a good question. That's a good question. So the Rambam answered as follows. It's a classic exposition of this. It's worth remembering. The Rambam says this. The Rambam, of course, was a physician, knew it firsthand, not only from his Torah knowledge. He describes, in answer to this question, the process of transition that the fetus goes through when it's born. You know, the Gemara says that when a child is born, what's closed opens, and what's open closes. You know that, I'm paraphrasing, I'm going to just give a little bit more anatomical detail here to the Rambam's exposition. But you know that a fetus who's unborn has features of its anatomy and physiology which are the opposite of a child who is, of an adult, of someone who lives in the world. I'm sure you're aware of that. The circulation, the blood circulation of the unborn child is not at all like the circulation of the adult. And the adult circulation is not at all. Not only that, but they're opposite. They're not just different, they're opposite. What's life for that one would be death for this one, and vice versa. An unborn child, the physicians present will forgive me for this description, but the unborn child, you know, its lungs are completely contracted. Right? No blood goes to those lungs. The blood supply that should feed the lungs is bypassed. The lungs are bypassed by a major blood vessel which takes all the blood away from the lungs. The child has a hole in his heart. He has blood pouring out of his umbilicus, major blood vessels pouring blood into the placental circulation. He has a completely different structure to his anatomy and his physiology, his blood flow, than does an adult. But not only that, the details that the child has there would be lethal if a person in this world had it. If anyone in this world were bleeding out of his umbilicus at the rate that the child is, or living underwater like the child does, or had lungs that were completely collapsed, or blood flow flowing away from the lungs, he wouldn't be able to survive. And on the converse, if a child in the womb had one of the features that we have here, it would kill the child there. So the child's living in a situation that's exactly the opposite to what the child needs here. Right? And then with that child living in that situation of perfectly adapted to its environment, it begins to be born. But that's an inevitable death process. The Gesher HaChaim, classic work on transition from this world to the next, uses the birth of a child exactly in this fashion. He talks about two twins in the womb and how they have an idyllic, almost genuinely transcendent experience in the womb. And he describes the experience of the one twin being born and how the other one mourns. Because the other twin knows that the birth process must end in death. This child is being thrust out into a world where there's nothing that it needs to survive. There's no way that it could survive, and the child mourns. But unbeknown to that child in the womb, what happens to the child who's born? You know what happens? I can tell you firsthand, it's a remarkable thing. You should try it sometime. When you hold a newborn child in your hands, you know what happens? The first thing that happens is the child begins to die. Child goes blue, purple, and it must, because it has everything that it needs to kill it, and nothing that it needs for it to survive. And as you hold that child in your hands, within seconds, within 2 minutes, 3 minutes, all those things in exact concert reverse themselves. Remarkable thing. You hold the umbilical cord in your hand, and it's pulsating with blood flow. And you know the blood is being pulsated, pressure, at great pressure, pushed out into the world. You know how much blood a newborn child has? Enough to fill this mug. That's all. That's the entire blood volume of a newborn child, and it's been pumped out at a rapid rate. That's a manifestation of crisis. And as you hold that umbilical cord in your hand, you feel a muscular contraction. The cord clamps down and stops bleeding. At exactly the same moment that that's happening, this blood vessel that takes all the blood flow away from the lungs suddenly clamps down. At that, the blood is forced into the pulmonary circulation, to the lungs. As the blood hits the lungs, they pop open. At that moment, the child takes its first breath. And 2 minutes later, the child's doing just fine, perfectly adapted to this world. That must have taken a good few million years to happen by accident. But you may be sure. But anyone who thinks that's accidental needs their head read. A Jew doesn't look at the world that way. That's a remarkable concert of events that are happening that transition, cause a transition from one situation to its exact extreme opposite. Remarkable thing. But that's what it is. It's a transition from a sure end into the beginning of something that's much greater than what came before. And that is the depth of the concept of laughter. A woman who's prepared for that and understands what that means, somebody who has enough emunah, enough depth, they could laugh at that process. It takes a tremendous level to be able to laugh even while it's happening. The usual process is that it's all we can do to cope with it while it's happening. A woman in labor is not laughing. But if she's prepared and knows what it means, she can draw such tremendous strength from the knowledge of what's happening here that it becomes a completely different experience. And that is our approach. That is the tool that we use. And our approach to the idea of laughter. It is the manifestation of joy and surprise at the experience of transition from one thing to its exact opposite, from ordeal to redemption, from ordeal through crisis into redemption, which is so often the pathway. That's the idea that we need to know. Let's take this idea and apply it, allow me to apply it to the experience of ordeal, crisis, which is what we're discussing this evening. Let's build it on a model of a Torah event, a Torah series of events, which are the prototype, if you like, or the model on which we build this idea. You know that on a national level, our redemption is the process, as we said, of a messianic pain of exile into a situation of redemption. That was presaged, that happened before in the exodus from Egypt. Right? When we were in Egypt, in Mitzrayim, we were put through a crossfire, a crucible of pain and suffering, and it was that led to the redemption. Not that it was over and then we got out and we were redeemed. It's because of what we went through that we achieved what we achieved. In fact, we have a principle that everything that happens has happened before. Everything that happens has really happened before in a more nuclear sense. The light that's projected came from a higher source. That source itself is a projection of a higher source. And therefore, the experience of the Jewish people in Egypt is really a manifestation of the process that the brothers, you remember when the brothers sold Yosef, they sold Joseph, and they themselves went through a crisis in Egypt. And the events that they went through were the model which built the exile and redemption from exile, which we went through as a people, and which will build the final version of that transition. So let's look at that and see if we can pick out the theme of transition that we've been studying. You know that while we go through this discussion, you should keep in mind the process of individual torment and ordeal. What are the elements? What are some of the elements? Anyone who's lived and been through ordeals knows that some ordeals have some universal characteristics. Very often an ordeal has the characteristic of being unintelligible. Why is this happening to me, and why me? There's so many elements in an ordeal, very often, that are so strange and seemingly uninterpretable. Why am I going through this thing? What does this mean? This doesn't fit at all. And the depth of the ordeal, very often, is because it doesn't seem to make sense. In fact, many times in the depth of a trial, a person feels that if only they knew that they had to go through this, and that it has to be me, and that I need every detail. Yeah, I'd have the strength to go through. That's not the problem. It's not the courage to be able to go through this thing. It's the doubt about what this thing means, and whether I'm the right. There's the feeling of a wrong address here somewhere. That's an inalienable part of a test, of an ordeal. It's a level of emunah to be able to raise oneself to that level, to know that this has to be me and I need this, but it's not obvious. Another characteristic of ordeal very often is that it becomes protracted. It takes a long time. Very often a person feels, I couldn't take any more of this, and then it takes longer. And then a person says, this must be the end, and then it goes on longer. And when it's gone on longer, it goes on longer. And very often when it's gone on so long that it couldn't go on any longer, and it's gotten so much worse that it couldn't get any worse, it goes on longer and it gets a lot worse. And very often when a person thinks that it couldn't descend any further, the ordeal becomes a crisis. And of course, Kabbalistically we have an understanding that at the greatest moment of crisis, if it in fact is so bad that you couldn't hold on for one more minute, that's when you can begin smiling. Because if it's that bad that it cannot last one more minute, then hold on for one more minute. Because that's when it will end. Of course, it's then that many people lose their grip. But that's not the way to regard that. If it's become that bad, you'll never be put through anything that you cannot take. Right? A test is not given that way. And what happens when the final redemption occurs? Very often it's unexpected. It's from an unexpected source, at an unexpected moment. That seems impossible. Let's try and follow one experience of ordeal, which is the Jewish experience of ordeal. Let's spend just a few minutes together and study the process in order to learn the ideas in action, the ideas that we've been studying in application. All I wish to do with you is just share a simple insight into a process in Chumash. Let's just learn a little bit of Chumash, a little bit of Sefer Bereshis together, and see how we see these ideas in action. I will describe to you the process that the brothers went through, but you should keep in mind personal ordeal and personal crisis on a parallel track at the same time. What happened to the brothers? They sold Yosef, right? They made a mistake. What happened then? Tragedy descended upon them. And when they came back to their father, when they came back to Yaakov, and he understood that Yosef was no longer alive, he entered a phase of mourning so intense that he lost his prophetic insight. And that lasted for a long time. You know how long that lasted? 22 years it was before they saw their brother again. Right? I don't know how they survived that ordeal. And not only was it a protracted ordeal where they had done that to their father, but the consciousness that they had was that they destroyed the world. You know that Yosef was a key in the transition to the Messianic phase. We have a concept of Mashiach ben Yosef, who will bring in the Mashiach ben David in some way. And Yaakov Avinu needed Yosef. His relationship to him was such that the process involved Yosef being a key in the final redemption. And they had just eliminated that. And when they saw the depth of despair that their father went through, that he was completely disconnected from the spiritual world, in a sense they had terminated his life, they became aware that they terminated the future of the world. The world is here for the Jewish people to manifest as a people, that those 12 sons should bring tribes into existence, those should form the Jewish people should bring the Torah to the world, and that should bring the final, be the agency of the final redemption. And their consciousness was that they had destroyed that. And talk about ordeal, talk about guilt and oppression and a sense of failure. Right? And the proof that they were wrong was that it did not get better. It continued and continued, and it got worse. Not only that, but you know the commentaries say that when Yaakov Avinu was mourning and the brothers watched him mourn, they watched a man mourn with the intensity of the first shock of a loss. You know, normally the process of mourning, Le'aleinu, is a process that gets lighter as time goes by. You know, the simple psychological understanding of that is that the reason that the mourning is alleviated, or that the mourning lightens as time goes by, is because one becomes used to the situation, or because memory becomes jaded, memory fades. But there's a deep understanding in some of the deepest Torah sources that states that the reason that mourning becomes lighter with time is because the one who's mourning is spiritually connected to the one who has departed. And the one who's left this world is going through certain spiritual transitions, tikkunim, deep ideas that we don't grasp fully, but that neshama is going through certain phases of elevation. And there's pain in those transitions. But as the neshama goes through those phases and is elevated from stage to stage, the person who's spiritually connected to them, who's obliged to mourn, the one who has a soul connection, a relative, from the same original spark, is going through those changes in sympathy. You know, there are commentaries that say that when a person refuses to mourn, it's a cruelty. Because you have the opportunity to journey with that neshama and to alleviate some of the pain of the transitions that it's going through. And therefore, when that neshama goes through its changes, and the one who's left behind mourns, so it's journeying together with that neshama and bearing some of the load, and it's also living in concert or in tandem with what that soul is experiencing. And because that neshama is going through higher and higher stages, the one who's left behind is lifted out of mourning in a corresponding set of stages. But Yosef wasn't going through those changes. Yosef had not died. And in the spiritual world, he was not going through those changes. So Yaakov Avinu was left with the shock of his initial consciousness of having lost his son. And he was not given the gift of being lifted through those stages. So he mourned in the acute stage of mourning for 22 years. It was inconsolable. What happened after the brothers were put through that? After it lasted longer and longer and longer, and they had to deal with living in a world that they had the awareness that they destroyed, that they had curtailed and brought to. So like ordeal often does, ordeal descended into crisis. They began starving. There was a famine. I'm sure you remember the story. I don't have to remind you of the details of the process, but there was a famine, and they were starving. So what happens? They go down to Mitzrayim, to Egypt, to buy food. They leave Binyamin behind because Yaakov cannot separate himself from Benjamin, another son of Rachel Imeinu. The loss of one has been almost too much for him to bear, so he keeps the other one with him. And the brothers go down to Mitzrayim and they want to buy food, and they begin a strange torture. A strange individual begins tormenting them in ways that cannot be understood. You're spies and I don't believe you, and they know immediately that it's because of what they've done. That they knew. But why the process was happening and why these details, they're on their way home, they find their money returned, that doesn't make any sense. They put through all the steps of ordeal and crisis. But this is the way to learn Chumash, right? We're just simply here going through a simple exercise in understanding the simple level of the meaning of a sequence of events in Chumash. What happens? Finally, Yosef, their brother, unknown to them, says to them, I want you to verify your story. Go back to your land and bring back the young brother you spoke of. And you'll leave a hostage with me. Keep Shimon. The brothers go back. And the crisis is deepening. And the confusion is deepening. They go back to their father. They tell him that we have to leave Shimon behind. He wants us to send Binyamin. Yaakov cannot part from Binyamin. It's a life and death matter for him to part with Binyamin. If anything would happen to the child, he wouldn't survive. But finally, the crossfire of an ordeal is always built in such a way that there's no way out. If you had an option and a way out, it wouldn't be the crisis that it is. But they finally get squeezed into a corner where there is no way out. They're starving to death. And one way or another, they're not going to survive. So the brothers say, we have to take Binyamin down. And eventually Yaakov has to agree. There's no other way. And he finally watches his son recede into the distance. Another son. What is Yosef doing to them? Why is Yosef putting them through this ordeal? Because behind the scenes, unknown to them, he's building their correction. All he wants to do is put them in the same situation they were once in 22 years before, and this time get it right. So he wants to build. You see, you don't know that while you're going through the ordeal. You don't know. You think you've got the wrong address for this test. But what's being built is what you need to achieve your correction. And the confusion and the pain and the suffering of it is exactly what you need. And finally, what happens? Yosef wants to get them in a situation where he incriminates Binyamin, and there's evidence that the boys let them down, that it's he and it's his fault, and he wants them to turn on him with a tremendous temptation to beat him down and drop him, just like they dropped his brother all those years before, and this time against all odds, and in the face of all logic, to stand by him. What is the process of tshuva? It's arriving at a situation where you once were, or being able to stand in a situation where you once failed and this time not failed. The Rambam says that's a definition of tshuva. To be able to deal, you should not go into such a situation, but to be able to deal with a situation that you once got wrong, and this time get it right. And Yosef is inexorably building that experience. He's going to put them into the same trap, and this time, and they're big stakes. The stakes are the correction of their neshamas. The stakes are the future of the Jewish people and the future of the world. We're talking about the most massive stakes imaginable. And what happens? They go down to Mitzrayim, they go down to Egypt. And what happens? You know that one of the elements of ordeal, we omitted to mention it before, but again, a person who has been through these experiences in life will know. One of the classic components of an ordeal is that there's an illusion of redemption. You know that we have a tradition that in the messianic process there will be a false messianic experience. It's an inevitable and integral part of the experience. Right? There's an illusion of redemption, and then the real crash occurs. It takes tremendous strength to go through these things. What happens? Isn't that what happens? They go down to Mitzrayim, they verify their story. Yosef says to them, fine, I see you telling the truth. He gives them all the food they need, and they all go back. They're all on their way home. A tremendous uplift. Things are going to be fine. And as they're about to cross the border, they're on their way back to their father. Hoofbeats behind them. They turn around. They're being overtaken. There's an accusation that they've stolen Yosef's cup. And in whose sack is it going to be found? Yosef wants to put them in a situation where they have everything they need to turn on him and drop him. And of course, what he's trying to build is an experience where they'll be faced with that opportunity, and this time they won't. And what happens? That's what they do. With every reason in the world to turn on him, they stand by him. They go back to Egypt, and then they face the prospect of complete oblivion. The Sfas Emes says that all that faced them at that critical moment when they faced Yosef again was two options of total oblivion. What could they do? The one option was Yosef said to them, look, leave Binyamin here, he's the culprit, and go home to your father. So if they would have gone home to their father, all the Mefarshim say that if Yaakov would have just counted them in the distance and seen that Binyamin was not with them, he would have died of grief on the spot. Kill Yaakov Avinu, kill Yisrael. That's kill the Jewish people at heart, in essence. What was the other option? To become mass murderers. Mass murderers, to destroy the entire known culture of the time, which was Egypt. In fact, Yehuda, as the leader of the Jewish people, turned to his brothers, and he said to them, if we're forced into this, this is what we'll do. You each take one city and wipe it out. I'll take 3 and destroy them. We'll lay Egypt waste, become mass murderers on an unprecedented scale, destroy the world, and we'll exit the ruins of this destroyed world with that. Can you imagine those options? So with those two options of destruction facing them, right, and no way out, and with a clear consciousness that this is what we deserve, right, Yehuda steps forward and he says to Yosef, in paraphrase, I don't know what this means, and I don't understand the confusion that's going on here, but I know I'm responsible. And I promised my father to bring him back, and therefore, take me. Right? The ultimate yielding of the ego, the ultimate statement of responsibility. Right? Instead, the circle has finally been closed. Instead of dropping the one who has evidence that he deserves to be dropped. Right? At that moment of crisis, Yehuda, representing the Jewish people, leadership of the Jews, steps forward and says, take me. And at that moment of crisis and death and oblivion, right, which hung in, they heard the words, Ani Yosef. Imagine what those words meant. I am Joseph. At which moment? Impossible moment. The moment of complete, the brink and beyond of oblivion. And from where? From the source of the problem. From the source of the torture, right, is the announcement of the redemption. Right? That the source of the, you know what the Chumash is telling you? That it's the ordeal that is your redemption. It doesn't come from someplace else and you breathe a sigh of relief that the thing's over. It is the experience that's the redemption. You know that we have a concept that the next world, transition from this world to the next. In the next world, the Kabbalistic description of the next world is that it's a place of trees. You know, we talk about Gan Eden, a place of trees, should not be understood in a childish fashion. But whatever those trees mean, you know, the word eitz in Hebrew, tree, is the root etzem, which means that it's a place of intrinsic, etzem means actuality, or deep reality. Gan Eden means a place of essence, of essential intrinsic existence. That's what the trees mean over there. But those trees, the tradition we have says that in that world, tama eitz, get tama pri, that the tree tastes the same as the fruit. What does that mean? It means that you can walk up to a tree and the tree is edible. In this world, only the fruit is edible. The tree is a hard, woody substance that brings out the fruit which is sweet. But in that world, the tree is the fruit. What does that mean? But the concept is this. The process of generating fruit is a process the tree brings out the fruit. The tree itself is not edible, it's not sweet at all. It's a hard process that takes a long time, which brings finally to the tachlis, it brings the fruit about. But in the next world, the concept of the next world is not getting to a place where Baruch Hashem, the ordeal's over. You breathe a sigh of relief that it's over. It's the ordeal that is the meat and it is the essence of the redemption. In that world you see that it's the tree itself that is the fruit. It's not that which brought it out. In this world it looks that way. But when you get there, and at that moment of revelation, you would not give up any moment of suffering for the world. And particularly your moments of greatest suffering, because it's those that built you. And it's those that are the intrinsic and essential features of what you are now. You know, when those boys heard Ani Yosef, and suddenly in one instant they realized and understood the whole process they'd been through, you think they would have given any of it up? They now began to cherish and relish every moment of confusion and every moment of agony, and the fact that it was so protracted. And every detail of the suffering they'd just been through just became their source of pleasure. They suddenly realized that a process that looked like destruction was really the building of their perfection. That is funny. That is humorous. That is what genuine laughter comprises. Of course, you'll realize they weren't laughing. They didn't laugh when that happened. They didn't laugh. They were so shocked by the revelation they couldn't move. Yosef had to speak to them in Lashon Kodesh, in Hebrew. He had to embrace them. He had to bring them proofs of who he... They were so shocked by that transition that they could hardly stand it. And this is the part that's not so funny. What does that mean? I mean, isn't that funny? If you'd been standing there on the side and you'd been seeing these boys go through year after year of their lives with an awareness of destruction deepening and deepening, and finally you have revealed to them in one instant that everything they'd been going through was exactly the opposite of what they understood. Isn't that funny? But they weren't laughing. And the reason is because when that person falls flat in tremendous disgrace, in exact reflection, opposite of what he was before, it's funny if you're watching, but it's not funny if it's happening to you. And the humor is if you're standing on the sidelines and watching. When you're going through that transition, it's not funny, it's only painful. The one who runs to help such a person who's gone through such an indignity, right, in cosmic form, right, and one who's gone through it in almost slapstick fashion, right, who's become the butt of a pathetic joke, right, the onlookers are laughing, but the one who's experienced it is not laughing at all. And the pain of that transition is enormous. You know that those brothers who went through that transition were men who had only made one mistake in their lives, more or less. And that had just been corrected, and they were so struck by the shock that they couldn't laugh at all. What will we feel like? And that's the reason that we try to live upside down in this world. We don't mind if they laugh at us now. We'd rather go through that than be laughed at when the thing turns inside out. And the art of living as a Jew, and the skill of living as a Jew, is to live inside out here. The world thinks it's funny, that's fine. Because when the world's turned inside out, and we turn out to be the right way up, so that will be a moment of laughter. Then our mouth shall be filled with laughter, but not now. And therefore, that is the application of this idea. We can finish by just noting, let's just note this on the level of the Jewish people. We are named for laughter. Aren't we named for laughter? Who was the first Jewish child, if you want to put it that way, ever born? Yitzchak. Avram Avinu carved out a reality for himself, Avram and Sarah, and the first child born to that ideology in the world was Yitzchak, which means he shall laugh. And how was he born? His parents expressed the response to the news of his birth with laughter. They both laughed. What was that laughter? The laughter was the response to an impossibility. They were too old to have children. Avram was too old. Sarah was infertile. The Gemara says, Ein la vlad, ein la beis vlad. She had no womb. Here was a man too old, a woman too old, completely infertile. The most impossible thing to imagine was the birth of a child. And Hashem arrived and said, you'll have a child. And they laughed. They laughed. They didn't laugh in disbelief. They laughed the spiritual laughter. They laughed the laughter of moving through an impossible transition. That is the Jewish people. Yitzchak is born when it's completely impossible. We begin where the impossible ends. That's who we are. We begin where despair ends. That's where we just begin. That's funny. And that's why we're named for laughter. Not now, we haven't laughed through history. There are very rare moments that the Jewish people have laughed throughout history. But it means Yitzchak, it means shall laugh, what you call the last laugh. And who is Yitzchak? The man of laughter. What is his quintessential experience in life? He sacrificed on the altar. Yitzchak is sacrificed at the Akedah. Avraham Avinu takes a knife, and he brings the knife down, and you know what happens? Yitzchak gets up off the altar and walks away to get married. You know the next event in Chumash after the Akedah? Yitzchak gets married. And what's left behind him on the Mizbeach? Efro shel Yitzchak munach lefonai. The ashes of Yitzchak remain piled on the altar. He was burnt. Right? He was burnt. When that impossible event happens, when that impossible transition from death to life occurs, the impossible result occurs. The Jewish people become a people who can walk away throughout life as human beings and yet have transitioned into a state of transcendence. That's who we are. We live in this world physically, and yet we've been completely burnt as a transcendent offering that projects us into the next. You know, the Arizal says that the word Yitzchak, if you take the word Yitzchak simply, the letters spell Kates Chai, death in life, the redemption in the oppression. That's what Yitzchak means. The one who can live in this world already sensing the dimension of redemption. That's who Yitzchak is. And that's who we are. And therefore, that's the meaning of laughter. Does not mean the emptiness and the infantile laughter of a generation that is insensitive to pain and suffering and tries to escape it by some or other form of drunkenness and forgetfulness. That's not our concept of laughter. Our concept of laughter is Vatischak leyom achron, a woman of depth who understands what birth is, understands what it means to give life, understands what it means to go through the pain that is the pain that generates life. She's the one who has to teach the message of Az Yamal Eschek Pinu, then our mouth shall be filled with laughter. And it's this concept that should take us and all those among the Jewish people and the world at large who are suffering and going through agonies, should be able to take us through one day after another, lead us in the next week, few days into Purim, which is exactly that experience of laughter. It's the experience of coming out from behind the mask into the opposite, into the revelation of an opposite, that a moment of destruction, of universal destruction for the Jewish people, it flips and snaps unexpectedly and impossibly into a moment of redemption. And it's the ordeal and the trial and tribulation that Jewish people are put through, which is what generates the depth that causes the merit of the redemption. That's exactly what Purim is. Pesach is that experience. Pesach happens in the spring where the transition is revealed. Purim happens in the winter where it's hidden. But both dimensions of redemption are dimensions of being brought out from an oppression and a suffering and it's almost certain, appearing certain death experience into an experience of redemption. And that is what we have to become. The Jewish people has to become the woman who is able to bring birth to the world. Az Yamal Eschek Pinu, then our mouth shall be filled with laughter. And if we can generate that depth, and if we can learn, as a woman does, to go through the pain that does not look like a birth experience, in order to bring genuine birth into the world, then we can say, Vatischak leyom achron.